Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. There have been thousands upon thousands of airplane crashes in U.S. history, but today we're going to focus on just two, both impacting New York City. Nearly 150 people were killed in these two separate accidents, involving both passengers and persons on the ground. Now, amazingly, two people survived, and we're going to have their stories too. Our guest today, who knows all about these crashes, is New York City historian Keith Taillon. Keith is an author on city history, and he conducts tours. He's also host of the popular Instagram page, Keith York City. He's going to be along in just a moment with today's two incredible tales. This week's trivia question: there were two of them used as a signal. Why was that important? Stay tuned after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the story for next week's show. Flying is the safest way to travel, statistics show that, but it wasn't always the case. And that doesn't even mean that in today's modern aircrafts there aren't some risks involved, of course. In fact, in the U.S. alone, there have been thousands upon thousands of airplane crashes with thousands of fatalities. Some crashes involve just a small single-propeller plane with only a few people on board, and others involve major commercial airlines with hundreds on board. Now, over time, plane crashes have become less frequent, and in that way they are similar to trains and automobiles. The more we learn about how to build and operate all these machines safely, of course, the better the accident record becomes. The very first successful flights, and here we're talking about the Wright brothers, and for those who think Gustav Whitehead was the first, him too, those occurred just over 125 years ago. Now, today's two plane crash stories, which both involve the densely populated New York City, were from 80 years ago and 66 years ago, respectively, meaning that they were still in the earlier years of flight history. Now, 80 years ago, a plane, believe it or not, if you've never heard the story, ran into the Empire State Building. But that mighty building didn't collapse. In fact, it reopened just 2 days later. And also, 66 years ago, two planes collided in midair over the city. Altogether, these crashes accounted for nearly 150 deaths, and they were among the most memorable plane crashes over this busy city. Well, here to tell us these stories is New York City historian, author, and tour guide Keith Taillon. So, Keith, today we're going to talk about not just one, but actually two spectacular plane crashes involving New York City. And I use the word spectacular advisedly. In this case, I'm using the actual definition, which is exceptionally dramatic. And I think that both of these cases can qualify as that. I mean, one is the plane that ran into the Empire State Building 80 years ago, and the other was a mid-air collision over Staten Island and Brooklyn 66 years ago. And I saw the picture when I was a kid of this plane stuck in the side of the Empire State Building, that it had just crashed into the Empire State Building. It was a foggy Saturday in July of 1945. And this is just, by the way, a couple of months, to put this in context, a couple of months before the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. So this is a B-52 military plane. We're still technically in World War II. Pick up the story. What happened?
Yeah, so it was a foggy Saturday. The United States was still very much in war mode. You know, this is the era of blackouts in the city. My grandmother, who grew up on Staten Island, remembers from her childhood having to black out the windows, turn out lights at night. So everybody in New York City and across the country was very much in the mindset of wartime. Even though we were near the end of the war, they couldn't have known specifically when the war was going to be ending. So everybody was kind of braced for the effects and the feeling. But what nobody expected was this literal collision of this relatively new technology of air travel, this bomber plane that was doing a pretty routine run up the East Coast, got lost in a fog bank and crashed into the world's tallest building, which at the time was only 14 or 15 years old. So when you talk about a spectacular crash, there's really nothing more spectacular than this symbol of American wartime might, this bomber plane flying into the side of this, 1400 foot tall building that represented all the economic might. And so to have those two crash together in the middle of Manhattan, the most densely populated island in the country, one of the most densely populated in the world, was a really, really just jarring event. So essentially what happened was a very seasoned pilot, Lieutenant Colonel William F. Smith, was moving his plane from point to point, and his goal was to get to Newark, the airport just across the Hudson River in New Jersey. But on this particular day, there was a really thick fog bank descended over the whole region. And what seems to have happened is Captain Smith got disoriented in the fog, got turned around amidst the skyline of Manhattan, possibly mistook the Chrysler Building for the Empire State Building or vice versa, and took a wrong turn thinking he was heading a different direction. But in meaning to turn away from the skyline, turned directly into the roughly 80th floor of the Empire State Building and crashed just smack into the center of the facade high above the city streets below.
Now, he hit the building, the Empire State Building, between the 78th and the 80th floors, and the plane just sticks in the side, doesn't it?
Right. So some parts fell down to the street, but there are these incredible photos of the aftermath where there's just this gaping, blackened hole in the side of the Empire State Building with visible remnants of the wing and the fuselage sitting inside the building. Because the Empire State Building is made of such robust materials, stone, really heavy steel frame construction, the plane basically just made a hole and then laid down in it and burned itself to a frame. What you end up with is this really dramatic image of this relatively new building. Again, the Empire State Building was only about 14 years old at the time. So this symbol of the 20th century and progress, with this other symbol of progress, American might, this military plane, just inserted into the side of it, basically.
Now, you have a situation here where this particular day, July 28th, 1945, was a Saturday. So a lot of people weren't at work that day, were they?
If there is a lucky aspect to this story, the lucky thing is that the Empire State Building, which would typically on a full work day have been filled with hundreds, if not thousands, of employees of dozens of different businesses and governmental operations across its 86 plus floors. But because it was a Saturday, there was a literal skeleton crew of people, elevator operators and doormen, and a few different companies that had a few employees on site at the time. So what could have been a much, much deadlier disaster was actually pared down to a tragic minimum.
So in total, 14 people died, including this pilot, Smith. There was a guy named Albert Perna. He was a Navy machinist, and they didn't find his body for a couple of days. Why was that?
The plane partially severed the elevator shafts of the building. So this gentleman from the plane, actually his body fell down the elevator shaft. And so he wasn't found until cleanup got underway, significantly after the crash itself.
And one of the amazing parts is that this B-52 bomber did not have any bombs on board at the time, which was very lucky. And because it was near the end of its flight, and we think about these things because of 9/11, its fuel tank was relatively empty, wasn't it?
Correct. Because they were nearing approach to Newark, there was a minimum amount of fuel left in the tank. And because they were just doing routine trial runs of the plane not heading to or from any kind of a military front, the bomber was as empty as it could have been, which is part of the reason why the Empire State Building was left so relatively unscathed considering what happened. It was because there was no real explosion. The fire burned out relatively quickly. There wasn't this added amount of literal fuel on the fire that could have made this a much more horrific event.
20-year-old Betty Lou Oliver. Now, we're going to go into her story, the survivor. This was going to be her last day on the job. Tell us about that.
Yeah, she was about to get married. She was in this position working as an elevator operator at the Empire State Building, which itself was an interesting thing because typically a job as an elevator operator in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, this would have been a job held by a man. Typically, it was a much more binary stratified workforce, and someone like Betty Lou typically wouldn't have been working as an elevator operator. But with this being the era of World War II, most men who ordinarily would have worked that sort of a job were on the front or in various theaters around the world. And as you said, it was meant to be her last day. She was due to get married. Her fiance was returning from the front. And so it was meant to be a very, quiet but momentous moment for her. And unfortunately, what happened was when the plane hit the Empire State Building, she was thrown violently from the cab of her elevator onto the floor of one of these upper floors of the building. She suffered some minor injuries. And when rescuers began to go through the building, combing through to find victims and survivors and people who needed help, they found Betty Lou Oliver with some minor injuries, but just enough that she couldn't make it down. So they strapped her to a gurney, loaded the gurney onto one of the seemingly undamaged elevators, and sent her down toward the ground floor. But what nobody could have known is that when the plane hit the building, it partially severed the cables of this other seemingly undamaged elevator. And as Betty Lou began to descend around the 75th floor, the cables snapped, and the elevator in which she was strapped to a gurney began to plummet down the nearly 1,000-foot remainder of the tower. Again, if there is luck to be found in this, Betty Lou actually survived the plummet. They think it was a combination of, one, the broken cables from the elevator coiled up at the bottom of the elevator shaft, providing a sort of spring or cushion, and two, because it's a small old-fashioned elevator that was fit very snugly into the shaft, as it descended, it created a sort of air pocket below itself. So ultimately, while Betty was horribly injured in the fall, she broke her back, she survived and was able to recuperate over the following, I think, 8 months before she was able to walk again.
Let's move on now. Airplane crash number 2. Now, this was from 66 years ago, 1960, back before JFK Airport was called JFK. It was called Idlewild Airport, for those who remember. And this one was much more severe in terms of fatalities. I think 133 people killed and all. Set this up. It was a Friday morning and 2 planes coming into New York. What happened?
The concept of air travel was still a relatively new thing. It was still relatively common for planes to crash or have really terrible turbulence or have to go through emergency landings. In fact, in the aftermath of this crash we're going to talk about, there was a news article that I read that mentioned as of 1960, there had been 15 mid-air collisions in the United States just in the previous 16 years. You know, it was still very much dependent upon the weather. It was still very dependent upon machine failure, human error, and getting a plane safely from point A to point B very much depended upon the quick thinking and skill of the pilots at the helm, and honestly, just a lot of luck. LaGuardia had only opened in like 1939. Idlewild, later JFK, had only opened the 1950s. You had Newark over in New Jersey, which is the oldest of the 3 regional airports, having opened in the 1920s. In this case, in December of 1960, it was a Friday morning. 2 planes were on approach to 2 different New York City airports. There was one plane heading from Chicago O'Hare to Idlewild or JFK, and another plane on its way from Dayton, Ohio to LaGuardia. It was a hazy day. It was relatively early in the morning, and midair over the east shore of Staten Island, these 2 planes collided. The TWA plane broke up midair, and pieces of it and its passengers unfortunately rained down over an Army airfield in the middle of Staten Island. Fortunately, there were no fatalities on the ground from that crash, but everyone on that plane perished. As for the United plane, however, it came through the initial crash relatively unscathed, except for the obvious problem that it had lost an engine. And so it continued to sort of glide north past Staten Island and bank to the right over Brooklyn. The obvious logic being the captain was probably going to try to limp the plane along to one of the landing strips, either at Bennett Field or Idlewild or even LaGuardia, just wherever they could get safely to the ground, but didn't make it, and ended up crashing into a densely populated, densely built up neighborhood of Park Slope in Brooklyn. Now, this was middle of the morning, so kids would have been at school, people would have been going to and from work, they would have been just kind of getting their day started if they were at home. And suddenly you've got this massive steel body of an airplane crashing right into the middle of this neighborhood, shearing the roofs off some buildings, setting about a dozen buildings on fire, raining debris and oil and everything else down onto the people on the street. It was a horrific scene both on Staten Island and in Brooklyn. And again, you've got, as you said, this kind of spectacular juxtaposition of the realities and density of urban life, the biggest city in the United States, one of the most beloved neighborhoods in Brooklyn, their normal morning being rent apart by this sudden explosion of violence.
You tell this story of the only, I believe, survivor off that United plane that crashed in Brooklyn being an 11-year-old boy who was, coming from Chicago, as you say, to New York City to spend Christmas with his family. What happened to Stephen Baltz?
Stephen Baltz was both lucky and unlucky in that he didn't ultimately survive long term, but he was the only survivor out of both planes. He was lucky enough to have been thrown free of the crash and land in a snowbank on the side of the street. And so he was found alive, conscious, coherent, speaking by people. He was taken to a nearby hospital where nurses and doctors tried their best to make him comfortable. He seemed to have come through relatively unscathed and was heralded as this miracle of this crash, that there was this young boy, he was 11 years old, almost 12 at the time, and he was able to communicate. One of the nurses later remembered that she was very taken by the fact that, despite being so horribly injured, all he kept asking for was a television. He just really wanted to watch television from his hospital room. Despite all of this press attention and the seeming miracle that he had survived this unsurvivable disaster, what the doctors and nurses didn't realize is he had actually aspirated or breathed in burning jet fuel, which had burned a lot of his internal organs. And so there was really nothing anybody could do to save him, and he died a day or two after the crash.
Stephen Baltz passed away just 1 week before Christmas, the holiday he had flown from Chicago to spend with relatives in New York City. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Keith Talion, New York City historian, author, tour guide, and host of the popular Instagram page, Keith York City. If you liked this episode, please like it on the site where you found it, leave a comment on Apple or Spotify, and share it with a friend who also likes history. The answer to this week's trivia question: there were two of them used as a signal, and why was that important? Well, the answer was it was two lanterns hanging in the Old North Church in Boston, signaling that the British would be attacking from Boston by ships. You remember, one if by land, two if by sea. And after which, Paul Revere got on his horse and went to notify the folks in Lexington and Concord. Well, next week on Amazing Tales, a discussion with Paul Revere. That's right, Paul Revere, the third, a direct descendant of the original Paul Revere and a board member of the foundation that runs the Paul Revere House in Boston, and that is that city's oldest remaining standing structure. You won't want to miss this interview. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.